Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. After the sirens stopped, the first time the warning sirens stopped, I didn't notice. That sounds ridiculous now, because everybody remembers the sirens. The city tested them on the first Wednesday of the month for chemical plants, tornadoes, river incidents, whatever category the world was pretending it still had. On that morning, in Louisville, the air was cold enough that the Ohio River looked like it was breathing. I was already on the Kentucky side of the Louisville and Portland Canal, walking the narrow strip of concrete between the lock wall and the chain-link fence, watching a tow crawl upstream like it had all day in the world. That's what I did for a living. I watched moving water, steel boats, and machinery that never slept. I was a lock operator at McAlpine Locks and Dam. People hear lock operator and imagine a guy in a booth pushing a button, like a parking garage. They don't picture hydraulic power units the size of a pickup truck, gearboxes that moan when the temperature drops, valve stems that bind if you don't baby them, and a control system that's only as smart as the last electrician who had time to chase a fault before the next tow showed up. I'd spent the last 15 years learning the personality of this place, the way the river changed by the hour, the way the downstream pool could look calm and still be pulling at the miter gates like a hand on a sleeve, the way the chamber walls would echo when a towboat captain laid on the horn, and how that echo traveled across the canal and came back a second later, like the river was answering. The sirens were background noise to all of that until they weren't. That morning, I was in the control house, our glass and concrete nerve center with a view down into the chamber, drinking burnt coffee and scrolling through a maintenance log that still lived half on paper and half in a computer nobody trusted. My coworker, Nate, was on the radio with a tow coming into the upstream approach. Nate had been with the Corps a long time. He had the kind of voice that could tell a captain to do something complicated without making the captain feel stupid. "Hold her straight," Nate said. "You're drifting left. Bring her back. Easy. Easy." I watched through the windows as the tow's lead barge kissed the guide wall like a fingertip touching glass. The towboat's stern swung and corrected, big propellers churning green water into foam. The smell came through the ventilation system, river water and diesel exhaust, and the faint metallic tang of wet concrete. In the distance, somewhere beyond the industrial riverfront, I expected the sirens, a long rising howl, then the drop, then the steady note. It was test day. Nothing happened. Nate didn't notice, I didn't notice, the tow eased in, lines were thrown, the chamber filled with the heavy presence of steel, and my brain stayed where it always lived, in procedures, in checklists, in the quiet satisfaction of doing a dangerous thing safely because you respected it enough to do it the same way every time. We closed the upstream miter gates. They swung like two massive doors meeting in the middle, each leaf moving on hinges anchored in concrete older than most of the city. They didn't slam. They didn't crash. They moved with slow, deliberate weight, guided by hydraulics and geometry, the miter forming a seal that held back a river like it was a bathtub. I watched the indicator lights, watched pressures and positions on the control panels. It was all normal, the kind of normal you don't appreciate until the day it vanishes. An hour later, my phone buzzed with a text from my sister. "You hearing anything?" I typed back, "About what?" The reply came fast. No sirens, no news. People on FB saying something at the hospitals. I rolled my eyes, because that's what you do when the world still makes sense. People on social media said the same things every week. Chemical spill, bad air, lockdown, secret military, whatever, gave their day some shape. Then the radio crackled with something that wasn't Nate's voice. It was the emergency channel our supervisors used when they wanted your attention without calling your personal phone. "McAlpine, this is District," a voice said, clipped and strained. "Acknowledge." Nate looked at me. His eyebrows went up. I keyed the mic. "McAlpine acknowledges. Go ahead." There was a pause, like the person on the other end was choosing words that wouldn't exist in any manual. "Secure personnel. Reduce operations to minimum. Stand by for further instruction." "District, what's the issue?" I asked. Another pause. I heard other voices in the background, overlapping, stressed. "Confirmed incidents in multiple locations," District said. "Law enforcement is overwhelmed. You are to shelter in place until further notice." Nate mouthed, "Incidents?" I swallowed. "Copy. Shelter in place. What about navigation traffic?" "Do not process any additional tows," District said. "If you have a tow in chamber, clear it if safe. Do not bring any new vessels into the lock. Secure the site." The transmission ended. Nate stared at the window, like he could see the problem floating up the canal. I turned back to the tow in our chamber. A tow captain leaned on the rail of his boat, looking up at us. He raised a hand in a half-wave, like we were neighbors. He looked relaxed. He had no idea. I had a choice in that moment. Call down to him and tell him to get out, or treat it like a drill and follow the vague instruction to clear it if safe. I did what I'd always done. I went for procedure, because procedure was a rope you could hold onto when the ground moved. We finished the lockage. We opened the downstream valves to lower the chamber. Water roared through the system, churning and echoing. The tow settled lower, the gap between waterline and lock wall changing in a slow, predictable slide. When the levels equalized, the downstream miter gates opened, and the towboat eased out like a whale leaving a net. The captain looked up again. This time, he held up his phone like he wanted to ask if we had service. Nate leaned out the open window and shouted, "You need to clear the area. Go downstream. Do not stop here." The captain frowned. He nodded, like he understood, but his eyes said he didn't. He backed his tow out and disappeared downriver. When he was gone, the lock chamber looked empty in a way that made me uneasy. Empty concrete, wet walls, a strip of water moving like a living thing. The place felt too large without a vessel in it. Like a room after the furniture has been removed. Nate closed the window. "What the hell is going on?" I checked my phone. No service. The little bars were there, but nothing loaded. "Whatever it is," I said, "District's spooked." Nate snorted. "District is always spooked." Then the first scream carried across the canal. It didn't sound like a movie scream. It sounded like an animal. A ragged, broken noise that started high and dropped low as if the person making it ran out of air and kept screaming anyway. Nate and I froze. The scream came again, closer, and this time it was answered by another voice, shouting words I couldn't make out, and then a sharp, metallic bang like a wrench thrown onto concrete. Nate moved to the window and looked out. I saw his face change before he said anything. "Down on the service road," he whispered. I forced myself to look. The service road ran along the canal, fenced and gated, used by maintenance crews and occasional contractors. A white pickup was angled weirdly, driver door open, as if it had been abandoned mid-turn. Two men stood near it. One wore a reflective vest, the other wore a hoodie. The man in the reflective vest staggered like he was drunk. He reached for the other man with slow, clumsy hands. The man in the hoodie shoved him away and backed up, hands up like he didn't want to fight. Then the man in the vest lunged and slammed into him with a sudden burst of speed that didn't match the stagger. The hoodie man hit the side of the pickup. His head snapped back. He slid down, and the vest man dropped on him like a weight. I couldn't see details. I didn't see anything that would get a video flagged. What I saw was body language, desperation, panic. The hoodie man screamed again, loud enough that I felt it in my chest through the glass. Nate backed away from the window like the sight burned him. "Nope," he said. "Nope, we're not going down there." My mouth was dry. "Call it in." Nate grabbed the radio. The channel was chaos now. Multiple sites trying to talk. People stepping on each other's transmissions. Words like biting and unresponsive and security breach. The man in the vest lifted his head. Even from where I stood, I saw his face wasn't right. Not bloody, not mangled, just wrong. His jaw worked like he was chewing something that wasn't there. His eyes looked unfocused, but his body moved with a purpose that made my skin prickle. The hoodie man stopped struggling. The vest man sat up. Then, slowly, like a puppet being pulled upright, the hoodie man began to stand. Nate's radio slipped from his hand and hit the console with a plastic clack. "Tell me you saw that," he said. "I saw it," I replied, but my voice didn't sound like mine. The hoodie man turned. His head moved in little jerks, like his muscles weren't cooperating with each other. The vest man grabbed his arm and guided him toward the fence line. They didn't run. They shuffled, then sped up, drawn toward the concrete structure like moths toward a light. Toward us. Nate looked around the control house. It wasn't a bunker. It was glass, doors, a thin barrier between us and the outside world. "Lock the doors," I said. Nate didn't argue. He moved fast, bolting the main entrance. I closed the side door and checked the deadbolt twice. My hands shook. The control house sat above the lock, but it connected to the lock wall by a stairwell and enclosed walkway. Below, the lock wall had access points, maintenance hatches, ladders, galleries where electrical and hydraulic lines ran. The place was full of ways in because it was built for people to move through it. I suddenly saw every access point as a liability. From outside, another noise carried up. A steady banging, rhythmic, like someone hitting a fence over and over. Nate peered through a narrow window slit. "They're at the gate," he said, voice flat. "They're hitting the gate." The service gate at the end of the road was steel and chain link. It would hold for a while, but everything holds for a while until it doesn't. I tried to think like a lock operator, not like a person panicking. What did we have? What could we control? We had barriers. We had height. We had heavy doors and steel grating. We had cameras, if the system was still running. We had a backup generator for essential controls and lighting, but it was sized for equipment, not for comfort. We had radios, battery packs, a small break room with bottled water and vending machine snacks, and a maintenance cage with tools. We also had something else, the lock itself. 2,000 feet of concrete, steel gates, and moving water. A structure designed to control the river. A structure that could be a fortress or a trap depending on how you used it. Nate paced. District said shelter in place, like we're supposed to just sit here. District doesn't know what we're seeing, I said. They know enough to be scared. Another impact rattled the building. Not a big one, something hitting a lower door maybe. I went to the console and checked the system status. The main SCADA screens still showed gate positions, valve states, water levels upstream and downstream. There were alarms, communication faults, sensor errors. The whole system had that sick feeling like when a patient's heartbeat starts to skip. On a separate monitor, I pulled up the camera views. The upstream approach was empty. The downstream approach was empty. The service road showed two figures at the gate hitting it with their hands, heads bobbing, bodies slamming forward and bouncing back. Then another figure stepped into view behind them. then another, then 3 more. They were coming from the city side, from wherever the normal world had been. They walked like they didn't care about the cold, like they didn't feel it. Nate watched the screen over my shoulder. "How many?" "Enough," I said. The banging grew louder. Not just one gate now, but multiple points. Fists on metal, bodies on doors. The control house vibrated slightly with each impact, like the building wanted to shake them off. A crackling sound came from the ceiling speakers, our public address system. A voice, distorted, came through. "Hello? Hello? If anyone can hear me." Nate and I stared at each other. The voice was a woman's voice, breathless, controlled like she was forcing herself not to scream. "I'm in the maintenance yard," she continued. "I can see the tower. Please. If you're in there, please answer." I grabbed the microphone for the public address. My thumb hovered over the button. Nate shook his head hard. "No," he mouthed. "Do not." Another impact made us flinch. The woman's voice came again, more urgent. "They're on the fence. I can't hold." A crash, a scream, then static. Nate exhaled, like he'd been punched in the stomach. "We can't," he whispered. "We can't go down there." My stomach twisted because my brain was doing math. 1 woman might be a risk. 5 infected at our gate were a risk. 15 infected were a larger risk. The woman might be bait, but she might also be a person who worked here, who knew the site, who could help. I made a decision that felt both awful and necessary. "Get the weapons," I said. Nate blinked. "What weapons?" I pulled a key ring from the drawer. The big ring, the one for cages and closets we didn't use daily. Maintenance cage has bolt cutters, axes, the long pry bars. If we have to defend a door, I'd rather have steel in my hands than a stapler. Nate moved. He had that look people get when they stop arguing and start doing. While he went, I checked the river gauges again. The upstream pool level had climbed since morning. Not by a lot, but enough to notice. It shouldn't have been climbing like that. A normal rise could come from rain upstream, snowmelt, release schedules from other dams, but my instincts were shouting that something wasn't coordinated. I pulled up the flow information. We had a reading of average daily flow, but the real-time data was spotty, alarms blinking. Then the lights flickered. 1 flicker, then steady again. Then a deeper flicker, like the building took a breath and held it. Nate came back carrying a long-handled fire axe, a heavy pry bar, and a bolt cutter. He set them on the floor, clanging. "This is insane," he said. The lights flickered again, and this time they didn't come back steady. The overhead fluorescence dimmed, brightened, dimmed. Then, with a final shudder, the building went into emergency mode. The screen stayed on, but a tone sounded. Backup power sequence. A smaller set of lights stayed lit, emergency circuits. The rest went dark. The hum of the building changed pitch as equipment shut down to conserve load. Nate looked at me. "Grid's gone." "Or unstable," I said. "Either way, we need to manage our own power." The control house had a backup generator, but it wasn't magic. It drank diesel. It needed maintenance. It could fail if the transfer switch chattered or if the fuel got contaminated. If it quit, we'd be in a glass box with no lights and no cameras. Worse, the lock itself relied on power and hydraulics for normal operation. Some things could be operated manually, but manually in lock language didn't mean turn a little knob. It meant using hand pumps, bypass valves, and mechanical locks. It meant time, muscle, and exposure. And if the river level was rising, time and exposure were luxuries. I checked camera feeds again, more figures at the gate. They weren't coordinated. They wandered, stopped, listened, then returned to banging at metal when they heard the echo. They were attracted to sound. That much was obvious. They weren't strategizing. They were reacting. The lock was a sound factory if you made it one. Water rushing through culverts, gates moving, horns, alarms. I felt like I was sitting in the middle of a drum, and the infected were circling, waiting for the beat. Nate pointed at one of the cameras. "Look." The service gate had bowed slightly. Not much, but enough to show stress. The chain link vibrated as bodies pressed into it. "They'll get through," Nate said. "Not if we make them go somewhere else," I replied. He stared at me. "Where? The river?" I didn't answer him because I didn't like the direction of my own thoughts. Outside, a new noise rose up. A distant chorus of sirens. Not the test tone, not the orderly rise and fall, but a ragged collection of emergency vehicles moving without pattern. Police, fire, ambulances. The last organized gasp of a city trying to respond. Then, one by one, those sirens cut off. The quiet afterward felt like a physical weight. Nate's voice was small. "My wife's in New Albany." New Albany was across the river in Indiana. Close enough that you could see it from the lock walls. Close enough that you could cross in 10 minutes on a normal day. Not close enough when the bridges were choked and the streets were filled with whatever was happening. I wanted to tell him we'd get out, that we'd go find his wife, that we'd do something heroic and clean. But I couldn't lie, not to him, not to myself. "We're here now," I said. "We're alive right now. We keep it that way." He looked like he wanted to argue. Then another bang hit the low door hard enough that dust puffed from the frame. He nodded once. "Okay," he said. "Okay, what's the plan?" I turned to the site map posted on the wall. It showed the lock chambers, the canal, the control house, the maintenance yard, the powerhouse area, the fences, the access roads. I traced with my finger. "We need layers," I said. "We need to make this place hard to reach." Nate snorted. "Harder than a fence?" "Fence is a suggestion," I replied. "Concrete and water are not." I pointed at the lock wall access stairwell. "We block that door. We block the stairwell. We use tools, chain, whatever we have. We make it so if they get past the outer fence, they still can't reach us." Nate nodded, already thinking. "And the power?" he asked. "We check the generator fuel," I said. "And we reduce load, only essentials." Nate looked at the screens again. "Water level?" I tapped the gauge reading. "Upstream's climbing. If it climbs too fast and we're not managing the gates, we risk overtopping in places you don't want overtopped. Not the dam itself. The dam can handle water. I'm talking about lower areas, approach roads, galleries. Water gets into electrical spaces, it becomes a problem that doesn't care about infected." Nate swallowed. "You're saying we might have to run the lock." "I'm saying we might have to operate the gates to manage levels and flow," I replied. "If upstream inflow is rising and nobody else is coordinating, the safest thing might be to relieve pressure through controlled movement instead of letting water do what it wants." Nate stared at me like I'd suggested we start a campfire in a gas station. "You want to run machinery," he said, "when they're attracted to sound." "I want to survive," I said. Sometimes that means choosing the least bad option. We moved fast after that, like our bodies finally accepted reality. We raided the break room for bottled water, peanut butter crackers, anything with calories. We found a first aid kit and added it to our pile. Nate grabbed a box of disposable gloves from a cabinet, then looked embarrassed until I nodded. Infection control had been a joke in our minds earlier. Now it was the only thing I could think about. We dragged a metal filing cabinet and shoved it against the interior stairwell door. We looped a chain through the handles and anchored it to a fixed pipe. We wedged the pry bar through the handles like a crossbar. It wasn't pretty, but it would slow anything that didn't know how to work a latch. I used the bolt cutters to cut a length of chain link fence from a storage area and rolled it like a mat, thinking we could use it later to reinforce a doorway or create a barrier. The infected outside kept banging, but the sounds changed. Less rhythmic, more chaotic. Like they were getting distracted. I checked the cameras again and felt a small, cold relief. A handful of them had wandered toward the water. The river's surface reflected the emergency lights like broken glass. Some of the infected stood near the edge, looking down, heads tilting, as if they were listening to the current. They weren't smart. They were drawn. I didn't like the way my brain immediately tried to use that. The generator room access was down a level, inside a concrete enclosure connected to the control house by a narrow corridor. It was more secure than the main floor. We moved there, stepping into a different world. Concrete walls, the smell of oil and diesel, the faint vibration of a machine doing its job. The generator was running. A medium-sized diesel unit mounted on a base with a day tank and gauges. The sound was steady and reassuring, but it was also loud enough that I worried it might carry. I checked the fuel level, enough for a while, but a while was a word with no meaning now. Nate leaned close, shouting over the engine noise. "How long?" "Depends on load," I yelled back. "Could be a day, could be two, could be less if it's working hard." Nate pointed at a set of metal cabinets. "Tools?" I opened them. Wrenches, spare fuses, hydraulic fittings, a grease gun, boxes of rags. The practical stuff that made the place run. It felt like finding a set of bones in a world where meat had vanished. I pulled out a flashlight, tested it, and clipped it to my belt. I grabbed extra batteries. Nate found a portable radio, one of the handhelds used for field work. He switched it on, cycled channels. Mostly static. Then, faintly, a voice. Not district, not our internal channels. A public safety broadcast broken by interference. Remain indoors. Do not attempt. Static. Avoid contact. Static. Biting. Static. If you are hearing this. The word biting came through, clear enough that Nate and I both heard it. Nate's eyes met mine. Neither of us spoke because saying it out loud would make it real in a way we weren't ready for. The broadcast cut to static again. I shut my eyes for a second and forced myself to think, like the person who had trained for emergencies that were supposed to be floods and fires, not this. Shelter. Water, power, communication, defense, escape routes. And the river, which did not care what humans were doing. A new alarm chimed softly on the control panel monitor. A level alarm. Upstream pool climbing faster. I felt my chest tighten. "Something upstream is letting go," I said. Nate frowned. "Like what?" "Could be heavy rain," I replied, but the words sounded thin. "Could be a dam release, could be something failed." He stared. "Failed where?" The Ohio River wasn't one structure. It was a chain of locks and dams and regulated pools. If one operator up the river stopped doing their job, or if they abandoned their station, the river would continue anyway, building up behind structures until it found a way. That way could be overtopping in areas not meant to carry water. It could be flooding on the banks. It could be water inside places with electricity, which meant fire, which meant more chaos. And we were sitting in the middle of a project that, if mismanaged, could turn from a fortress into an island with no supplies. I took a deep breath. "We may have to use the lock as a relief valve," I said. "We may have to pass water in a controlled way." Nate's jaw clenched. "That means operating gates." "Yes, and operating gates make sound." "Yes." Nate stared at the concrete floor. Then he nodded once, like a man choosing between two bad roads. "Okay," he said. "How do we do it without ringing the dinner bell?" I didn't have an answer that felt good. But I had a plan that felt like something. "We do it once," I said. "We do it carefully, we keep it short, and we prepare to deal with the attention after." We went back up to the control room and looked at the lock system like it was a chessboard. The chamber was empty. That helped. To move water, we didn't need a tow. We needed control of gates and valves. We could cycle the chamber, open upstream valves to fill, then downstream valves to empty, using the chamber as a buffer. It wasn't a spillway, but it was volume. A long concrete bathtub you could use to shift levels and timing. The key was doing it without attracting a crowd that would overwhelm our barriers. I checked camera views again. The infected at the service gate had thinned. Many had wandered toward the riverfront. Some had disappeared behind structures. The constant banging had slowed. They were still there, but their focus had shifted. Now, in the distance, I saw something else. A small group of people moving along the far side of the canal, running, stopping, running again. Not stumbling like the infected. Moving like humans. Refugees. One of them fell, and the others dragged him up. Behind them, a cluster of infected followed, drawn by motion and noise. I watched it unfold like a silent film, my stomach twisting. Nate saw it too. "We can't let them into the lock," he whispered. "We can't let anyone into the lock," I said. But the words tasted wrong. The group reached the fence line and started shaking it, yelling. I couldn't hear the words through the glass, but their faces were turned up toward us. One of them pointed at the control house. Then the infected reached them. Everything became frantic motion. People trying to climb, infected grabbing. Hands, bodies, desperate scrambling. I forced myself to look away because the details weren't what mattered for survival. What mattered was that the outside world was collapsing right in front of our windows, and every human instinct I had was pulling me toward them like gravity. Nate backed away from the glass, breathing hard. "We can't," he said again, like repetition could make it easier. I nodded, but my throat was tight. The fence held for a few seconds. Then it didn't. The infected flowed through like water finding a gap, and in that moment, I understood something so clearly it made me cold. The infected weren't the only danger. The structures we trusted, fences, rules, the idea that help arrives, were all just temporary shapes. The group of refugees scattered. 2 ran toward the river. 1 ran toward the maintenance yard. 1 stayed at the fence, trapped, and then disappeared under a wave of bodies. Nate put a hand on the console, steadying himself. "Do we still do the water move?" I stared at the level gauge again. It kept climbing. "Yes," I said. "If we don't, the river will make decisions for us." I keyed the system for a controlled cycle. First, upstream miter gates stayed closed. Downstream miter gates stayed closed. We were using the chamber like a container, not like a passage. I opened the upstream filling system partially, enough to let water enter without the full roar. Even throttled, it sounded like the lock was clearing its throat. A deep, hollow rushing that traveled through concrete and up into the air. Outside, heads turned. On the camera feeds, infected paused. They tilted their heads towards the sound as if listening to a dinner bell. My stomach nodded. "Keep it steady," I muttered to myself. "Just keep it steady." Water level in the chamber rose. The gauge climbed. The sound continued, a low, continuous rush. On the cameras, the infected began moving toward the lock wall. Nate gripped the axe handle so hard his knuckles went pale. The chamber filled to the target level. I shut the upstream valve. The sound faded. For a few seconds, the world held its breath. Then, almost immediately, I opened the downstream emptying system. This sound was different. Water leaving the chamber, pulling, churning. It echoed louder, bouncing off the empty walls. Even with partial opening, it made a hollow thunder. More heads turned, more bodies moved. I watched the camera feed as infected started to gather near access points, near the stairwell doors, near the maintenance hatches. And then the first one reached the base of the control house stairs. It slammed into the lower door with its shoulder. The door shuddered. Nate raised the axe, standing between us and the stairwell like he could hold the whole river back with muscle. "Close it," he said, voice tight. "Not yet," I replied, staring at the gauge. "Not until the level change completes." The infected hit the door again. Then again. The chain and filing cabinet held, but the sound of impacts traveled up the stairwell like someone knocking on your bedroom door in the middle of the night. I kept the valve open until the chamber dropped to the planned level. Then I shut it. The roaring stopped. Silence crashed down like a wave. The infected paused, then continued hitting the door anyway because now they were here, and they didn't need sound to keep them angry. Nate's breathing was loud in the control room. That was the worst idea you've ever had. It bought us time, I said, though I wasn't sure yet what kind. I checked the upstream gauge again. It had stopped climbing as fast. The cycle had shifted pressure and timing, just enough to slow the rise. Not solve it, but soften it. I didn't feel relief. I felt the sharp awareness that I had just taught the infected where we were. The banging at the door intensified. Then, above it, a new sound. A wet scrape, like fingers dragging along metal. They were trying to get purchase on the door seam. "They'll get through eventually," Nate said. "We don't let them," I replied. "And how do you propose that?" he snapped, then immediately looked guilty. Sorry, I nodded. "I know." My mind raced through options. We could retreat deeper into the structure. The control house wasn't the only secure space. Below, there were galleries, concrete corridors that carried the lock's mechanical arteries. Some had steel doors, some had hatches. There were places designed to be closed off during maintenance and emergencies. The problem was those spaces were also closer to the water. If the river rose, those could flood. And if we flooded down there, we would drown like rats. We needed a better fortress than a glass control house. And then I remembered something most people never thought about. The lock was built to be operated during storms, floods, and emergencies. It had redundant spaces. It had a control house, yes, but it also had a control room down in the concrete, older, simpler, with fewer windows. A place where you could run essential functions even if the fancy tower was compromised. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't pretty, but it was built like a bunker because it was, in a way. "We move," I said. Nate blinked. "Where?" "Down into the old control gallery," I replied. "The concrete level. We can secure steel doors. We can create a choke point." Nate looked unsure. "And the water?" "We monitor it," I said. "We keep a pump plan. We keep the generator stable. We survive one problem at a time." The banging at the stairwell door became a constant pounding now, like fists on a drum. Nate nodded slowly. "Okay, what do we take?" "Everything we can carry," I said. "Water, food, radios, flashlights, tools, the axe, the bolt cutters, anything that lets us control our environment." We moved quickly, but every trip to grab supplies felt like a countdown. I took one last look at the camera feed before leaving the main console. The service road was overrun now. The maintenance yard had figures moving in and out of shadows. The riverfront had more of them than I could count, drifting, bumping into each other, turning toward any sound like iron filings toward a magnet. And then, on the far edge of the camera view, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A towboat downriver, moving without lights, drifting at an angle, bumping the guide wall. No captain visible, no horn, no control, just a big steel machine being carried by current. If that tow collided with the wrong structure, it could damage gates, it could block approaches, it could change flow patterns. The river was becoming a machine with no operator. And we were the last operators left in our part of it. Nate saw my face. "What?" I pointed at the screen. He swore softly, not loud, not dramatic, just a word that sounded like heartbreak. "That's going to hit." "Not if it grounds first," I said, but the words were a prayer, not a plan. We left the control house and moved down into the concrete. The stairwell echoed with each step. Our flashlights cut through dim emergency lighting. The air got cooler, wetter. The smell of concrete and river water deepened. We reached the steel door to the gallery and pulled it shut behind us. I spun the wheel lock, feeling the satisfying resistance of steel on steel. The pounding above became muffled. For the first time since the outbreak began, I felt like there was a wall between us and the world. Nate leaned against the door, breathing hard. "We're trapped," he said. "No," I replied, forcing steadiness. "We're sheltered." He gave me a look. "Same thing." "Not if we keep options," I said. The gallery was a long corridor with branches, electrical panels behind locked doors, hydraulic lines and steel trays, pipe runs labeled in faded paint. There were posted diagrams, old safety posters, emergency shut-off instructions. It felt like walking into the spine of a sleeping beast. We found the older control room, a concrete space with a steel desk, a panel of switches, and a window that looked into the lock chamber through thick glass at waterline level. The view was eerie, water sliding past like a dark hallway. I checked the panel. Some functions were still live, fed by emergency circuits. Gate positions were indicated by simple lights. No fancy screens, just the basics. Nate set the axe down carefully, like he didn't want to wake something. "This feels like a submarine," he said. I nodded. "Good. Submarines are built to hold pressure." The radio crackled again, and this time it was clearer. "Any core personnel, static. Reports of infected static, evacuate if possible. Static, do not engage." Nate looked at me, eyes wide. "They're telling people to evacuate." "Evacuate to where?" I asked. He didn't answer because there wasn't one. The pounding above continued, faint through concrete. The infected were still trying to reach us, but now they were working against a place designed to resist force. I sat on the cold concrete floor for a moment and let my mind catch up. We were two men in a lock control gallery with limited food and water, a generator that might run out of fuel, a river that was rising, and a city outside that had become a moving hazard. We also had something most people didn't. We had a controlled environment, thick walls, and machinery that could shape the world around us if we were careful. The lock could be our fortress. It could also be our tomb if we made one wrong decision. Nate broke the silence. "What do we do about the people outside?" I swallowed. "We stay quiet," I said. "We don't invite them in. We don't make sound." "And if someone knocks on the door?" he asked. I pictured the woman's voice on the public address system. I pictured the refugees at the fence. "We don't open it," I said, and hated myself for how quickly the words came. Nate stared at the floor. "My wife," he whispered. "I know," I said softly. "I know." The river slid past the small window like it was ignoring us. Then a deep, low vibration rolled through the concrete. It wasn't banging. It wasn't footsteps. It was something heavy contacting something else. Steel on concrete. The kind of sound you feel before you hear. I stood up, heart pounding. "That toe," I said. Nate grabbed his flashlight. "You think it hit?" We moved to the small window and looked out. At waterline level, my view was limited, but I could see ripples, unusual turbulence, and then, slowly, a shadow sliding past, big and rectangular. A barge, drifting. It scraped along a guide wall with a groan that made my teeth ache. Then another vibration, stronger, like the barge had bumped a structure harder. I couldn't see the impact point from here, but I felt it in the lock's bones. Nate's voice was tight. If it damages a gate, I finished, we lose control. Control meant water management. Control meant we could keep parts of the site from flooding. Control meant we might be able to create barriers, water moats, by opening or closing certain elements. If we lost a gate, the lock could become a useless concrete box at best and a flooding hazard at worst. I forced myself to think. The barge was downstream. It was scraping. If it lodged against the wrong place, it could block flow or damage equipment. But going outside to deal with it was suicide. Unless we could use the lock itself. Unless we could move water in a way that shifted the barge without stepping into the open. I stared at the control panel. "Nate," I said, "how much noise can we risk?" He looked at me like I was insane again. I pointed at the panel. "If we cycle water, we can create a push, not much, but maybe enough to change where that barge drifts." Nate shook his head. "And ring the dinner bell again?" "We're already the bell," I said. "They know we're here." The pounding above confirmed it. Nate took a long breath. "Okay," he said. "What's the move?" I laid it out quickly, controlled, short water movement. Minimal valve opening, no horns, no alarms. Use the chamber as a buffer to influence current in the immediate area. We did it, slow, careful. The sound was muffled down here, but I could still hear it. The low rush of water through the system. The vibration traveling through concrete. Outside, I heard distant banging intensify like the infected were responding. But the barge shadow shifted. The scraping changed pitch. The turbulence altered. Then the vibration eased. The barge was moving away from whatever it had been grinding against. I shut the valve. The silence returned, broken only by distant impacts. Nate let out a breath. "It worked." "For now," I said. He nodded. "For now." Hours passed in a strange, stretched way. We took turns, watching the small window and listening at the steel door. We rationed water by habit rather than necessity, because doing something structured kept panic at bay. We tried the radio every 15 minutes. We got fragments, evacuation orders, overwhelmed hospitals, bridges closed, avoid contact, do not attempt rescue, stay indoors. Once, we heard district again, faint and shaky, asking for any personnel to check in. Nate tried to respond, but the signal was weak. When the sun began to set, the emergency lights cast long shadows in the gallery. The concrete seemed to absorb warmth and hope, leaving only cold. The banging above lessened as night came, not because the infected were sleeping, because they weren't, but because the world outside got quieter. Fewer people moving, fewer vehicles running, fewer sounds to draw them. That should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like a city holding its breath before a final collapse. Nate sat with his back against the wall, axe across his knees. "What if it's like this forever?" he asked quietly. I stared at the control panel, at the simple lights indicating gate positions like they were the last honest signals in the world. "It won't be like this forever," I said. He looked at me. "You don't know that." I didn't. So I told him something true instead. "As long as the river moves," I said, "something will change." A little later, deep in the night, we heard a different sound at the steel door. Not pounding. A knock. 3 taps, slow and deliberate. Nate's eyes snapped to mine. The knock came again. Then a voice, low and hoarse. "Hello?" the voice said. "Anybody in there?" It was a man's voice. Not distorted, not frantic, controlled. Nate lifted the axe slightly, ready. I stepped toward the door, heart hammering. The voice came again, closer to the seam. "I know this is the lock gallery," the man said. "I'm not sick. I'm not like them. I'm bleeding, but I'm not sick. Please." Nate whispered, "Do not." I whispered back, "He knows what this is." The man continued as if he could hear our silence. "My name is Calvin. I'm a towboat engineer. I got separated from my crew when things went bad. I know how these gates work. I know you've been cycling water." My blood chilled. He was right. He'd noticed. He lowered his voice. "If you don't let me in, I'll die out here. And if I die out here, I'll be one of them at your door." Nate looked like he wanted to hit the door just to stop hearing it. I stood there, mind racing. A towboat engineer could be useful. He could be lying. He could be infected and coherent. Some early stage, some trick. Or he could be exactly what he said, a skilled person trapped outside our fortress. If we opened the door and he was infected, we would be handing him the inside of our shelter. If we didn't open the door and he died, we might still face him later, changed. I pressed my forehead against the cold steel for 1 second and made a decision that felt like it split me in half. I called through the door without opening it. "Calvin," I said loudly, "tell me something only a towboat engineer would know. Something about the lock." There was a pause. Then he said, "If you've got the newer longitudinal culvert system, those intakes are big square openings near the miter sill, and the valves are disc valves that rotate. If you open too fast, you get a surge and it'll slap a barge sideways. You know that. You're throttling because you're trying not to pull attention, and you're probably watching your upstream pool climb because someone upstream stopped managing their pool." Nate's mouth fell open. I felt a chill crawl up my back. He knew. Not because he was magic, because he was observant and experienced. He added, "And your generator's going to run out if you keep cycling without reducing load. If you've got a day tank, you're probably good for a day or two. After that, you're in the dark." Nate whispered, "He's real." I didn't move. "How do we know you're not infected?" I called. Calvin exhaled, and I heard pain in it. "You don't," he said. "But you can test me. You can make me strip my outer layer, check for bites, wash with soap. You can keep me in a secondary room for a while. You can watch my pupils. I don't know what this thing is, but I know I'm not acting like them." Nate shook his head, desperate. "We can't." Calvin's voice cracked. "I can hear them out here. They're close. Please." Silence. I looked at Nate. He looked back, eyes bright with fear and anger and something like hope, which was the most dangerous thing of all. I made the call. "We're going to take him in," I said softly to Nate. "But we do it our way, no mistakes." Nate's face tightened. Then he nodded once, like he was surrendering. I spoke through the door. "Calvin," I said, "you follow instructions exactly, you understand?" "Yes," he breathed. "We open this door," I continued. "You move fast. No talking, no sudden movements, hands visible. You will be secured until we're satisfied. If you lie, you won't get a second chance." "I understand," Calvin said. Nate and I positioned ourselves. Nate with the axe to one side, me with the pry bar, both of us behind the door line. I unspun the wheel lock slowly, feeling the heavy mechanism release. The door opened a crack. Cold air slipped in, carrying the smell of the river and something else, sweat and fear. Calvin slipped through the gap like a shadow, moving fast, face pale. He wore a towboat engineer's work clothes stained dark on one sleeve. His eyes were wide but focused. I slammed the door shut behind him and spun the lock. Nate raised the axe. "Hands," he said. Calvin lifted both hands, palms out. "Okay," he whispered. I shoved him toward a secondary maintenance room and ordered him to strip his outer layer. He did it without arguing, teeth chattering. We checked his arms, neck, hands. No obvious bites. Scrapes, bruises. A deep cut on his forearm that had bled through his sleeve. Nate watched with the intensity of a man guarding his last safe place. Calvin's voice was tight. "I can help you," he said. "I know you're thinking about water levels. You're thinking about fuel. You're thinking about how sound pulls them in." I didn't answer because I didn't want to give him control of the conversation. We cleaned his wound as best we could, gloved hands, soap and water, then bandaged it. We kept him in the secondary room, door closed, while we listened for changes in his breathing, his voice, anything. He didn't change. He just sat, shaking, and stared at the concrete like he was trying to remember what the world had been. In the early hours before dawn, Calvin finally spoke again, voice calmer. "Upstream," he said. "I saw a lock site abandoned. I saw a tow captain try to run through without clearance. I saw people on the riverbank get swarmed. I don't know how far it's spread, but it's not just Louisville." Nate's eyes met mine. The river chain was failing, and we were sitting on one of the most important choke points. Calvin continued. "If you can keep this place running, you can keep the river from becoming a disaster zone. Barges drifting, gates damaged, floods in low areas, but you can't keep it running with 2 people. You need a plan. You need fuel. You need a way to keep them away from your doors." I listened, and despite myself, I felt my brain latch onto the first real thing that sounded like a future. A plan. Not salvation, not rescue. A plan to keep a piece of infrastructure alive. A plan that could keep us alive with it. I looked at the simple gate indicator lights on the panel. The lock was still holding. The river was still moving. And outside, in the darkness, the infected were still searching for sound. I spoke quietly, more to myself than to either man. "Then we turn the lock into a quiet machine," I said. "We run it only when we have to. We build barriers. We move fuel. We make this place harder to reach than anything they've seen." Nate swallowed. "And what about my wife?" The question hung in the concrete room like a weight. I didn't have an answer that would make him feel better. But I had the truth, and the truth was the only thing solid left. "We survive first," I said. "Then we figure out how to reach anyone." Calvin nodded slowly. "You're thinking like an operator," he said. "Good. That might be the only kind of thinking that works now." Above us, faint through layers of concrete and steel, something scraped along the outer door again, as if the world was reminding us that our decisions had consequences. I tightened my grip on the pry bar. In that moment, McAlpine wasn't a job site. It was a control house in the purest sense, a place where control was the difference between a manageable disaster and a flood that swallowed everything. And as the first thin light of morning began to seep into the river window, I understood something else too. the sirens hadn't stopped because the danger had passed. They'd stopped because there was nobody left to sound them. And now, if we wanted warnings, if we wanted safety, if we wanted any kind of order at all, we were going to have to build it ourselves. One steel door, one quiet valve, one hard decision at a time. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.